So to start, I'd like to just say, like, we can take 10 seconds to think about what you think gossip is. So just take a few seconds to do it. I assume we all have like some idea of what you think gossip is. Then like take maybe a little bit more time to think about what you then thought makes what you thought gossip is gossip. So what is essential to making it gossip? I mean, we're a small group here, so maybe if someone feels like speaking up, you can also do it.
So it's trading information, but particularly about other people. So it has to be like about someone, maybe.
Yeah, sounds good. Maybe let's get one more. And then
So it's a sort of currency, but it's so it's related to your own standing in a group, but also the standing of the people that you talk about. So it's very much kind of group dynamics, sort of group management kind of thing about your place. But it fundamentally, it's a currency of form, I think, and the trading of currency.
Interesting. So we move a bit to a higher level here now. So I'll talk today a bit more about like a lower level of what the communication of gossip is. So we've seen something that might fit with this definition that I will try to convince you today is the best definition of gossip. So it's a sender communicating to a receiver about the target who is absent or unaware of the content, and this really captures the act of gossip on. So I'll go into detail about that later, but keep in mind a bit what you thought is gossip and what you thought is essential to gossip, and we'll go into that a bit later. So I'm Terence Dores Cruz. I was visiting Kim Peters here. I came from Amsterdam, where I work with Bianca Beersma, and I'll be here for around 2 more weeks until the 11th of November. So first I will give a quick intro into why you study gossip. So I think we all have some idea of gossip. You can even think about like these gossip magazines that are super popular, but I will be talking about something a bit different. That is like our interpersonal gossip. So when we're talking about other people, and this is something I think is even more prevalent and more important in our daily lives, gossip magazines. So indeed, gossip was a feature of our evolutionary histories, and I would say it's still a reason why we exist today. And you can indeed see that gossip is observed across many contexts and cultures, one of which is at the workplace, where I think many people spend the majority of their time, which means that a large part of our gossip actually also occurs at the workplace. There is some different ideas about the function of this gossip at the workplace. So one that has more positive outcomes. So, for example, it strengthens our group membership. It allows us to know the reputation of ourselves compared to others. There's also some ideas that gossip can have negative consequences for performance and, for example, for well-being at the workplace. So there's a bit of a contrast between positive and negative consequences of gossip. Now, this is made even worse by a complexity of what gossip actually is. So I assume if we would ask everyone here to say their little thing that they thought gossip was, it would all be slightly different. And it's actually the same in the scientific literature. There are some people who, for example, define gossip as any social topic. So it doesn't have to be about people, it's just social topics. Then there's people who say that gossip has to involve a sender, receiver, and a target. There's people who say that this target then has to be someone who's absent. There's people who say that gossip is, for example, only negative and only positive but not neutral. And there's people who say that gossip has to be informal. So, for example, when we walk to get a coffee, but not in a presentation like this. And there's people who use any sort of combination of these characteristics to form a definition, which means that there is a lot of possibilities for what gossip can actually be. We argue that this sort of difference in these definitions contributes to these positive and negative consequences or conclusions about what gossip is. And then this also leads practitioners to be confused about what they actually should do with gossip based on the research that there is on gossip. Do they promote gossip because it has these positive outcomes, or should they maybe try and warn about gossip and prevent it because it can have negative outcomes? To take a first step to be able to advise practitioners to do anything about gossip, we need a clear understanding of what gossip actually is. And that's what I'll talk about today. So you've seen this definition already, sender communicating to a receiver about the target who's absent or unaware of the content. And I'll also show you today that we think that gossip ranges in valence, or from positive to negative, and in formality from more informal to more formal. So how did we do this? we went and did a systematic review of all papers in social science literature on gossip. We found a little over 6,000 papers, and there were 324 slightly different definitions of gossip in these papers. From all these definitions, we coded several characteristics, and we found 4 that sort of frequently reoccur. And the first 2, as you will see, form the basis of this definition. So one is that gossip consists of a gossip triad of a sender, receiver, and target. And the second is that this target is someone who is absent or otherwise unaware of the content. So I'll go into a bit more detail about those first. So the first is that gossip consists of a triad of a sender who communicates, a receiver who receives the information, and the target about whom the information is. So this is the most basic definition of a gossip communication. What is important here is that each party could be multiple people, so it could be more people talking to more people about more people. But just to get the basic thing going, it's just a sender, a receiver, and a target, and you'll see this little triangle many times here. It's also important that this can be any kind of communication. So even though this icon depicts it as like a verbal communication, it can also be like sending a text message or an email or whatever, just as long as there is a sending party, a receiving party, and someone who is who's absent. So then we move on to this other person being absent or unaware of the content. So what we mean with that is that you can be absent of the content. If, for example, I will talk now in a different language that you cannot understand with someone, then you are, in a way, absent. So you're physically present, but you cannot hear content. Or you would like send a text message under the table about someone who is sitting next to you to someone else, then they are also not present in the conversation. So again, this is a basic feature of gossip. So if this target is not absent, then it is not gossip. So if we will talk about someone who's right here in the room, it wouldn't be gossip, it would be, I don't know, a direct confrontation or ridicule or whatever, but not gossip. What I think is why this is key is also this is theoretically one of the most important aspects of gossip. So it's a way to share information about other people when they cannot control the information. And in theories of like punishment, it's a way to punish people on their reputation without them being able to retaliate. So the idea is that they're absent, they never find out about the information, they cannot retaliate. Yes. So I hope that was somewhat clear. So these are 2 most frequently recurring characteristics and definitions of gossip. And that's why they are key to getting this first thing of what is gossip and what is not. And we identified 2 further characteristics. One is that gossip is evaluative, so it means either positive or negative. This was slightly less frequent, as was the sort of requirement that gossip only occurs in informal settings. So what we did with these characteristics, that they have a bit more of a range. So we made them into a framework. And not surprising, since there are 2 characteristics, it's a 2-dimensional framework. So one is valence, negative to positive, and the other is formality, from informal to formal. So I'll start with this valence dimension. So basically it means that gossip can range in the content from anything being negative, slightly negative, to neutral, to slightly positive, etc. So just a scale from completely negative to completely positive. For me, this is the most interesting dimension and where most of my work is focused on. So it's, for example, looking at different functions of positive and negative information that we share about others. So to illustrate a little bit how this can be interesting, I'll show a bit what I'm working on currently. So what we're doing is that if you think about gossip in everyday life, it's often seen as negative and often condemned. So people don't like gossipers. There's like religious texts that advise against gossip. Most practical advice you would Google like what to do with gossip in the workplace. You would say like try to prevent it or don't gossip or whatever. So it seems that those who send gossip are condemned. And there's some research support for this. So if people gossip negatively, they're disliked, distrusted, they have a bad reputation. However, some recent work shows that actually when the gossip is positive, it's likely to be rewarded and liked and result in a good reputation. So it seems that these consequences of gossip are moderated by this valence dimension. So it depends on whether it's more positive or more negative. So what we're going to do here is present people in a game with either positive or negative information about someone who will play an economic game with. And then we have them respond to this gossiper in another economic game so they can give or take points from them. And the idea is that they will take more points from people who share negative information and give more points to people who share positive information. If this thing holds that the consequences of gossip depend on valence. If not, apparently it's not true. So yeah, this information could also be true or false. And we ask people also to send their own positive and negative information to see if they make a difference in this. But this is just to exemplify how you can use this valence dimension, for example, to manipulate things in experiments. Then there's this slightly more complicated dimension that is about formality. So we say that gossip ranges from informal settings to more formal settings. I think informal settings are kind of clear to most people, so it could be indeed talking at the coffee machine, at the water boiler, whatever. Formal are things that you might not really consider gossip, but if you think of this definition of gossip, then it would be. So it would be information about someone who is absent. So you can think of a performance review or character evidence in a court case, for example. So it's all information about someone who is absent, but it's shared in a more formal channel. So it's part, for example, of your work tasks. So I think this is a more interesting dimension for organizational side. So I've taken the time to think about some things that would be interesting to study here. So I mentioned already that some formal types of gossip would be performance reviews or reference letters or character evidence. And what is interesting about this is that it's, in my eyes, communications that are not necessarily considered gossip, but could be, and therefore might be understood through a lens of gossip research to provide new insights. Another thing that is nice is that these types of communications are often archived, so they might be more easily accessible for researchers than regular gossip, which is supposed to be somewhat more secretive and therefore more difficult to pick up. This leads also into a possible research line in perceptions of gossip or impressions of the amount of gossip that there is. So many people are aware of the types of formal communication that is about there. So you know that your boss has to fill out a performance review of you at some point. But if you cannot access it, then you don't know the content. So you know that there is gossip about you, but you don't know the content. But this content would be accessible for researchers. So you could see if, for example, people's ideas about how they are evaluated match with what is actually on record, if you get access to it. Another thing that I would find particularly interesting is comparing this formal dimension. So you could say that the impact of gossip would be moderated by formality. So if you think of a reference letter, it would be the most formal type of gossip. You could compare it to a conversation over a coffee as a more informal type. And you could, for example, see how this has impact on the hiring process. So does a reference letter, for example, carry more weight due to its formality compared to a chat over coffee due to its informality, or is it the other way around? People value informal information more than this sort of more constrained formal information. So we're also allowed to look at these types like reference letters or performance reviews through lenses of reputation-based cooperation, which are more in biological theories of cooperation. It might be less prevalent in organizational psych research. I have some time to run through this. So I have some examples to make this slightly more vivid, like what this framework entails. So you could think of, I can't see here. You can think of a positive performance review. So it's a gossip about someone who is absent in a formal way, and it's positive, so it would be here at the top of the framework. So you could use this to categorize gossip that you either have observed, have heard, or have collected through other means like questionnaires. So you could move to the other side of the framework. You could think of derogating another colleague over coffee. So the colleague is absent, the information is negative, so to place it right here at the bottom of the framework. You could think of more neutral information on both. So you could say that a colleague is on holiday. So it's not necessarily negative information, it's not necessarily positive, it's just a fact. But it's in a work setting, so it might be formal or informal. It depends. I could say I'm looking for a meeting or whatever, just so you know. So I would place this, for example, more in the middle of the framework. Now you might think, why do we propose this framework? Does this actually match to gossip that we observe in everyday life? And I will show you today that actually it does. So if we think of the framework again, we'll be valence here on the y-axis, and we'll have the informality on the y-axis and the informality here. So if you look at this graph, it became a little bit ugly, but it should be fine still to interpret. So we see here the valence and formality. You see that there is a variation in these dots. So every dot represents an experience of Dutch people in their everyday life sending or receiving gossip. So there's more informal gossip here at the bottom, it is -1. But formal gossip is not completely absent. So it means that at least some part of gossip is captured by a formal dimension. And there's a huge spread in valence. Now we looked a little bit more fine-grained at this formality dimension in a different setting. So we asked a sample of Dutch teachers to, at the end of every day, indicate whether they had sent gossip, received gossip, or thought they had been the target of gossip. So here we see a huge spread in this formal dimension. So there's a bunch of experiences of gossip that people categorize as being completely informal to completely formal. So there is a huge variation in this. Interestingly here, the valence range was much more constrained. So it seems that it differs per setting how the variation of gossip experiences is. And maybe in really more organization settings, it seems that there is much more negative gossip, whether it is good or bad, it's really clear to say from this data. Anyway, so in conclusion, if you think about gossip, it would be a sender communicating to a receiver about the target who is absent or unaware of the content. And you have to think about gossip as varying in valence from negative to neutral to positive, and informality from completely informal to more formal things. I could end with some opportunities to use these data, so you could use the dimensions and the framework to describe and classify information from questionnaires, interviews, observations, social networks, or archive data. As I showed, you could use these dimensions to manipulate things in experiments, for example, using economic games. And taking a broader perspective, you could use these parameters to in agent-based models that would simulate larger organizations or evolutions over time. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and happy to take any questions.